Hello and welcome to this demo of the OR switch. Let's check out what's to come before we get into it. Now the OR switch is a collaboration between Ali Modular, Ali the architect, AFRORACK and the North Coast Modular Collective. All good people doing good things, and there's links to the three of them in the description. Now the OR switch is a 3 HP passive, meaning it needs no power, dual channel OR switch. A has 3 inputs, B has 3 inputs, and we switch between whether A or B is active at the output. Now an OR switch or OR combiner will actually merge gate signals together, so we could have a mixture of different rhythms, irregular rhythms, random gates, clocks, and switch between this rhythm, sending that off to open envelopes or trigger drums around the system. When we put audio modulation in, this works as a max logic. You may have seen min and max modules around. The maximum voltage across all 3 inputs is what would be at the output, and it half-wave rectifies, cutting out any negative signals. We're going to use this for audio, crunching and adding character with this half-wave rectification. We're going to use it for modulation, use it for gates, use and abuse it, and just try and look at kind of everything we might do with an analog OR logic or combiner. So let's have a really simple demo of OR switch before we start to use and abuse it in some different patches. The hi-hat sound in the background and the green trace on data is ×1 of my clock. I've got 3 different rhythms. You can see these on these LED cables into my mutes module coming up into channel A to be merged together in the OR switch. Now I don't have an input on B, so being switched to that is simply a mute. I'm muting or stopping the gates coming through. When I come up to the top channel, this is triggering my synth voice, and I have a divide 2, divide 3, divide 5, and I can send different gate patterns into this channel and they will merge or mix together. So here I'm using the OR switch to switch between 2 groups of gate rhythms to trigger the envelope on my bass sound. Now here's that bass sound on its own. It is sidechained against the kick in this beat. On the top channel here I've got a single gate input playing quarter notes. You can just hear it's on beat. My output is coming through mutes, which is a really nice pairing because I can simply just switch the output of the OR switch off. Leaving that on and switching down, have a combination of 3 different gate rhythms, and with mutes added to mute some of these and the output, I can really play around with the rhythms, combining them, switching between them and muting them. Bringing an extra sample in over the top. So the OR switch can actually combine modulation signals, and I have 3 LFOs from Oct on these purple cables, channel A, and 3 on the yellow cables, channel B. We can see it there on the scope, and as I flick down to B, notice it half-wave rectifies, but then as a slower LFO comes up, that takes over, and this is working like a min or max module where it outputs the maximum voltage between the inputs. And you can see those moments of silence where it's not letting the negative voltage from these bipolar LFOs through. So it's an interesting way to half-wave rectify, mix modulation sources, and of course to do this over multiple channels and switch between them live. So here's an audio signal, but this would apply to modulation as well. And this is a green trace on data. Just a low-pitched triangle wave. If I flick over to the version that is coming out of the OR switch, that's the blue trace on data there, and we can see it comes up positively and then clips. There's no negative signal. It's also quieter, and that's because it's lost half of its signal. Now if we look at this wave folded wave, the yellow one, and switch over to that in the OR switch, again we can see this kind of clips out at 0 volts and lets no negative voltage through. And it's quieter, but it's also a different tone with this audio. One nice thing we can do is to use noise as an input. If I simply take out my triangle, add in some noise, you can see we get a really crackly, interesting tone. So again, we're losing half of this audio signal. And being that our switch with multiple ins to combine signals, we could have a half-wave rectified triangle with some added kind of crisp and fuzz from some noise. So because the OR switch will half-wave rectify any signal that comes into it, we can use it as a quirky audio effect. So here's my dry beat in my mixer, and muting that and turning on the outputs of the OR switch in my mixer. It's this lovely crunchy, crispy version. Here's adding a bass sound to this. Again, clean, this isn't going through the OR switch. And then the half-wave rectified version at the output. So here I've zoomed in so you can see this really lovely bouncing waveform, and I'm plugging 3 different oscillators, 2 of which are static. One is being modulated through a moving bandpass filter into the OR switch. It's mounted upside down, and I'm muting my audio. So it's just a really simple example of this half-wave rectification, chopping off all the negative voltages in the audio, finding the maximum voltage, which is what comes out of the output. It's not really a true mixer, but in practice I'm thinking as mixing these 3 oscillators and giving them some interesting color and character. Here the OR switch is being used to mix my modulation and also mute my modulation, which when there's no modulation passing, it's actually muting all of that synth line. I'm removing the drums that they're playing against. I'm mixing this green trace, envelope, blue trace, LFO, and pink trace, stepped sample and hold into channel A, and the output is that yellow trace. We can hear all the envelopes come through really nicely. This LFO occasionally makes the sound fade up, and the higher steps in this sample and hold will push all of this that little bit higher. So it's this interesting hybrid of all the inputs. It's just a really nice way to mix modulation and of course mute that in a performance as well. So as the OR switch is passive, there's nothing stopping you running it the other way around. We can actually put a signal into the output and switch between where it goes in a patch. So it could be a 1 to 6 signal router or 1 to dual bank of 3 signal router. So I've got a basic kind of synth voice coming in. It's been crunched up with some character with that half-wave rectifying that's inherent in this circuit, and it's switching from coming out cleanly with that half-wave rectification and coming out of these 2 top channels, one of which is bit crushed on the right, and the other is going through some delay. So as we've just seen routing audio in and splitting it to 2 different places when we switch through channels A and B, here I'm routing in modulation, and interestingly we found that this half-wave rectifies the channels when we plug inputs in and come out in normal expected functioning. We go into inputs and out of outputs. Because it's passive and we're going the other way, input into the output and splitting across these channels, it half-wave rectifies but the other way around. It only lets negative voltages through when we go the other way. It's kind of the opposite behaviour to what you might expect. But we're also using it in the opposite way you're meant to. We're taking an output as an input, and then we're splitting across the inputs which are now outputs. So here's my modulation, and the cables match this trace at the bottom of data when it's the yellow trace bouncing around. We're switched onto channel B, and the input here is coming out of these three B stage connections. It's modulating stereo image, so it'd be good to have some headphones on. And when we flick up, the signal now comes out of A, just this single output, and it's modulating the frequency of my filter. That's it for this video on the OR switch. It's a very simple passive module, but I wanted to show a lot of ways to use this for rhythms, modulation, audio, processing, splitting signals, kind of abusing it by using it backwards. Do check out all the links to AFRORACK, Ali Modular, Ali the Architect, and the North Coast Modular Collective linked in the description. Hit like, subscribe, leave a comment, support my work on patreon.com/DivKid if you like, and I'll see you next time. Cheers for watching.